The Hungarian faculty. Her name is Bernadette. Forgive me, my Hungarian pronunciation. Kolmár.
Kolmár.
Exactly. She is taking care of the next topic, which is the origin of it. The evolution of money. I don't know enough about you to introduce you any further, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, my presentation will be quite short, and it's about the evolution of money. How something becomes a medium of exchange has always attracted the attention of philosophers and people active in economic science. And taking a closer look on how people exchange things, it is natural for us that somebody would give away goods in exchange for something more useful to him. But trading away goods for small metal discs seem useless in themselves, or for documents representing value may seem mysterious for us. So we can say that there is a curious interest in the nature of money and its distinctiveness compared to other objects of trade throughout the history of mankind. And we can ask the following question, like Karl Menger: how did money come about? In Hungary, in primary schools, we start learning history at the age of 10, and we are carefully taught that in the beginning there was barter, and then people invented money, and that's all. As I was doing my research on the evolution of money, I bumped into David Graeber. He's an American anthropologist, and his book, The Debt, The First 100 Years, is the title of the book. And
first 5,000 years.
The first 5,000 years, sorry. 100, yeah, the first 500 years. And he has an essay on the myth of barter, and in his essay he brings up a problem that most of the mainstream books on economics depicts a situation something like this. Once upon a time there was barter, it was difficult, so people invented money. Then came the development of banking and credit, and that's it. This is kind of a chronological order on the evolution of money. And this process seems that it is so deeply established in common sense that people can't really imagine any other way that money could possibly have come about. So there is a standard historical version on the origins of money, but anthropologists try to point out that there is something wrong with this picture, and I'd like to talk about this problem and try to reveal the true history of the evolution of money. Okay. It's also common in the mainstream textbooks that they start their story with a fantasy world of barter, and the problem is that where to locate this fantasy time. Are we talking about cavemen or an undiscovered tribe living in the Amazon rainforest? And I read a book from Niall Ferguson, The Ascent of Money, and he also starts with the same thought, and he brings the Inca Empire as an example, that they did not have a real concept of money, but they did have labor as a unit of account, which which is interesting that one of my friends told me that in prisons, work like mopping the floor and such works has kind of a value among prisoners, or they use a cigarette to trade. Actually, now I'm a kind of a newbie learner of economics, and I have never ever given a second thought on how barter works and worked, and how money evolved. And now I'd like to deal with a little with barter, the advantages and disadvantages. We can assume that at first there were some kind of no exchange economies where basically people try to satisfy their own needs. And then supposedly the emergence of private property slowly transformed the no exchange economies to barter economy. Obviously, the history of barter is older than the recorded history of money. Just think about it. The direct exchange of certain services and resources for mutual advantage is intrinsic and intrinsic to the symbiotic relationship between plants, insects, and animals. So it is not surprising that barter is as old as man himself. And what is interesting that this kind of exchange persists up to the present day. And the most important advantage of barter is that no one parts with value in return for mere paper or token promises, but some worthwhile goods or services. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages we should take into consideration. There is the double coincidence of wants. It is an essential feature for barter. Here is a standard example. In pure barter, if the owner of an orchard having a surplus of apples wanted a pair of boots, he had to find not simply a cobbler, but a cobbler who wanted to purchase apples. Moreover, there remained the problem of determining the rate of exchange. Today, the essence of money is the ability that we can compare at a glance the relative values of any goods and services. And another obvious drawback of barter is the absence of generalized or common standard of values. And we could continue on counting the disadvantages of the barter system. And as I was reading Graeber's essay on the myth of barter, something grabbed my attention, that most of the mainstream books leave out an important fact, namely that human beings are the participants of these exchange, and they are in some kind of a relationship with each other. They can be rivals, lovers, friends, and this fact determines the conditions of exchanging goods. It is possible that in small communities everyone simply keeps track of who owes what to whom. And the other problem, the exchange rate, maybe was solved in these barter economies in a rough and ready way. They established a series of ranked categories of types of things. So there were certain things that could be traded for others. I mean, maybe for clothes, for spears. And anthropologists refers to it as spheres of exchange. And they point out that maybe cross-cultural barter operated according to similar principles. One of an interesting form of barter is dumb or silent, so-called silent barter, where direct and possibly dangerous contact was deliberately avoided by the participants. And I'd like to talk about another form of barter, which is called modern barter. This is associated with monetary crisis, especially with in case of runaway inflation. And sadly, the world record for inflationary currency belongs to my homeland, Hungary. Its note in circulation grew from 12,000 million pengős in 1942 to 100 million bill pengős, and I'd like to show you a few pictures. This is from the collection of my grandmother. He collected this is pengő in Hungarian. So here we can see 10 pengős from 1936, and then 100 pengős from 1945, and then 1 billion pengős. And the biggest was 100 million bill pengős, and you can see with I don't know how many zeros. And after the inflation, you can see how many banknotes were on the streets. So this is my grandmother's collection. And my grandfather, when we visit him, he always tells us a story when it's about when he was a young man. He went to the capital of Hungary and exchanged half a pig that he carried with him in a processed form in a huge suitcase, and he exchanged it for radio and suit and soap and many other useful things. And then pengő was so we had then the forint after pengő from 1946. Okay, so I'd like to go back to the evolution of money. One of the most important improvements over the simplest form of barter and toward primitive money was the tendency to select one or two particular items in preference to others. These items were selected because of their qualities, although they still could be used for their primary purposes. These items were chosen for a number of reasons. Some because they were conveniently stored and easily, and they were easily portable, or some because they were more durable. But surprisingly, barter was not and the disadvantages of barter was not the main factor in the origins of the earliest development of money. The most common non-economic forces which gave rise to primitive money were the usage of bride money, blood money, ornamental and ceremonial use, and religious and political use. And later on, because of the widening functions of money, these roles began to weaken or fade away. Actually, loving and fighting are the oldest of man's activities, so it's not surprising that certain payments associated with these are among the earliest forms of money. And now I'd like to mention a kind of a linguistic evidence on the evolution of money, namely that the etymology of the word pay, it's from Latin, and it pacare, and it means to pacify, to make peace. Okay. Experts actually disagree on where to draw the line between primitive and modern money. Actually, it is in the nature of money that such a distinction is almost impossible to make. Money can perform many functions. Therefore, as an institution, money is almost infinitely adaptable. And this helps to explain the varieties of origins and the number of different kinds of objects that were used as primitive money, like amber, beads, cattle, and so on, vodka. And actually, I didn't mention cowries and cattle is there, but cowries and cattle were used long after the introduction of coins and banknotes. While making my research, I read an interesting story about a boy from Nigeria who used to collect lost cowries during the local fair days. And if he managed to collect 7 or 8 cowries, he could buy a meal or something useful to play with. And he later became the first professor of banking and finance at a university in Nigeria and an executive director of the Central Bank of Nigeria. So, okay, and now I'd like to move on to the evolution of precious metal money. To primitive man emerging from the Stone Age, any kind of metal was precious. The distinction between base and precious metals became significant only after their skills as a metallurgist had improved. And they started to use objects like swords, spears, axes as a kind of medium of exchange. And it's interesting that later on, for example, in China, they created replicas of swords, but in a reduced size. And this was their first, not the first, but they used it as a primitive money. Later on, the rising civilization and the division of labor and its natural consequence, the gradual formation of cities resulted in diminishing the marketability of primitive monies and increased the marketability of metals in use. And because of their easy extraction and malleability of copper, silver, gold, in some cases in iron was gradually used, they became popular. So they started to use precious metals to create coins. Okay. Here are just a few examples of the first coins in China and the Greek drum, if I pronounce it well. And it's interesting that these coins appear totally separately on the different part of the world. So finally, we arrived at the appearance of coins, and we can call it, or some economists call it, as the modern money. So basically we can see that contrary to what Adam Smith says, that money is the creation of the government, we can see now that money is not the product of an agreement on the part of economizing man or the product of legislative acts. No one invented it. With the progressive development of social economy, money just came to exist in numerous centers of the civilization independently. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. I think Bernadette has different sources used here, like Niall Ferguson. There is a historian, Niall Ferguson, and is that a different person from the economist Niall Ferguson?
No, it's the same person.
It's the same.
Yeah.
And the point that Bernadette was trying to make is that money is in fact a spontaneous, social, coordinated action by teleological, purposeful acting people, which was the point. And it's never been the creation of any authority. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we should be anti-authorities, because the role to play for an authority is still there. They could be the people standing behind the mint by standing as a surety for their fineness and their weight, and they would protect that jealously if that was only their role. That could have been their role, but we know different from medieval history. Unfortunately, they abused power to do some other things. Right, Rudy, do you have? We have questions?
I disagree wholeheartedly. Government has no role. It's private enterprise that will ensure the purity of the coin, and the marketplace will. And as soon as the government gets involved, the debasement starts. And nobody can stop it because the government has the gun. So, you know, I'm in the manufacturing industry. The underwriter laboratories are not government controlled. The insurance companies pay for them, and they make sure the electronic devices are up to snuff. So private enterprise will always do better than government.
I tried to give him a break, but they screwed up.
Yes. Sorry about that.
I disagree on another ground.
You disagree?
Oh, so sorry.
Okay.
Well, I think the first coins, from what I know, were created by the Libyan king in Anatolia because the mercenaries, the Greek mercenaries, demanded equal pay. And that was the first demand of equal pay that we have recorded by Eötvös. And because they did not want to be given gold in general, and he had a lot of gold, he had to cut coins of the equal size, equal weight, and stamp them with his own stamp. So you have initially the involvement of the government immediately from the beginning of coins. So it is really very interesting how it changed from a means of equal pay and democratization of payment.
But before he got involved, there was a screw-up because they actually demanded equal pay, which wasn't there.
They were mercenaries. They would have demanded a lot more if it was not that.
So it's only after they put some, well, I would say gun, but in that case a sword against his head or his neck that he complied. Right.
Okay.
I see you put up my private address.
How do I get my presentation?
I'll
Okay.
do that. In the meantime, if you have a question, please address them.
To me? I'll be doing the origin of interest now for the remainder of until the 1 hour question period at the end. So we'll just wait for my
Lecture note, is this the one?
yeah.
It's up here. There we go.
There we go. And
Can I ask a question? Something's just come out. Is the New Austrian School actually saying that they don't agree with the idea of government having a role to play in the issue of whatever the currency is, whether it's coinage or paper money? Are you saying that it should simply be left to private enterprise?
As the professor was saying, the manifesto is up for discussion.
I would say yes. I would say yes, but I'm only a member. I think it would be unusual if the others didn't say, because that's where I get my opinion from. So
I think most people would be having, by this stage, have a mouthful, or with authorities. I think we all have. Compliance was the word that Rudy used, and there's too much compliance. We've had a bellyful of regulations and a bellyful of authorities.
We've had 100 years of socialisation, effectively.
That's another big word,
look
socialisation.
100 years ago, I mean, children were almost still in the mines and going up chimneys. We had to have some.
Was that to blame to the gold standard at that?
No, we've had politicians who have basically been unable to remain prudent with control of the purse. But we could go from one extreme to the other, and what might be a danger is that we get the extreme of the complete opposite, going back to everything's got to be private. We mustn't have any form of looking after the poorer members of society and ensuring that children aren't. I mean, if we could get one extreme to the
I agree with all of that. Sort of, you have to be a good human being and whatnot. But the problem with the state and money is that if it comes to coinage, the state came in to just regulate the quality of the coinage. Let's just say they did that, and that's fine. You can do that. But then the impetus is to give that regulated coinage a name, like the denarius or something. So we've just given it a name, and there seems nothing wrong with that. But then the concept is to take the name as money rather than what it was the name of. And people are very easy to confuse. Well, they weren't back then, but now they are. On that basis, it's the name that's money, or they want you to believe that the name is money. And it's sort of like, if an alcoholic is put in front of 5 bottles of whiskey, it's just a temptation, So the joke that I had was that I have a sovereign made by Coca-Cola, a gold sovereign, and it's exactly the same size as the sovereign that's made here. I have more faith in the Coca-Cola gold sovereign than the state sovereign, because they have to keep the quality of their coins high. I mean, not only would it be a bad mark on them, no one would buy their products or whatever. So if the shops and the retailers make provision for excellent coin themselves, then that's 99% of the problem solved. And throughout history, they did actually do that. They created their own. They were only allowed to call them tokens, though. So they'd given a name to the shilling, but if you produced something that's exactly the same as a shilling, you can't call it that, though, which is the first step, to Armageddon, basically. So we've had examples of when retailers have tried to introduce and the coinage has always been superior. The retailers always produce superior coinage to what the state can, because there's much more behind it than the state just doing something for the sake of doing it, for the sake of cohesion or whatever.
There is in fact an excellent book out by Selgin. I think his name is George Selgin. He's an American, Austrian, if you like. Never mind, he wrote an excellent book on the coin circulation in England 150 years ago, 200 years ago. I'm trying to remember the name or the title, but if you Google George Selgin and coins in Britain, you'll end up on the topic, and that is exactly the point that Sandeep is making. It is natural, or it was and still is natural, for the coin makers of Manchester, where there was a scarcity of proper coin, to make their own tokens of high quality, and they circulated for a good reason. Whilst I think it was called a farthing. I'm not sure with all the names that the British use for their coins, but they were in dear. There was a very little supply, and they're very worn, and whatever replaced that money issued by the people themselves, that's circulated.
So there are precedents for this, but they were quickly sort of hit and sort of said, well, you can't do it. You can't even call it a token. Just stop it. You know, I mean, you're getting in our way. And
there is good reason for authority to intervene if they behave, and that's always the question. Yes, Professor.
If I may add my penny of wisdom to this, but this is a diversion, right?
Always.
Okay. So I think we all agree that the greatest invention of humans was the invention of the wheel. I think it's pretty uncontroversial statement. So the question is, what was the second greatest invention? Well, here's the answer. It was very similar to the first, because it's also round. It has to be. And that's the coin. And this was actually, we can fix the time, 500 BC, right?
Mm.
In the country Lydia.
That's the point that
Yeah, okay.
Professor was making.
So you can read up on this. But here is something. This is my favorite pastime, etymology, the analysis of the meaning of the words. The English word tail has several meanings, and I am not referring to the conventional meaning, such as in fairy tale, but as a verb, you have that combination, exchanging by tail.